I'm a driver for a funeral home. This is my story. I don't think there was ever a time where I wasn't fascinated by the other world. Whether it was stories, legends, or even movies, the idea of the afterlife always piqued my interest. I don't know what about it made me so eager to research, but the mystery of not knowing what could be lurking in the shadows was exhilarating to me. It was just an interest at first, but over time, it grew into something more. Maybe it was my quiet nature that led me to be more introspective and solitary that allowed for that curiosity to build. Some of my earliest memories were of my grandparents telling me stories and legends from their home country. They lived close to my house, and after school I would go right to their place, eager to see them and to hear another one of their stories. They were more than just my grandparents. They were the ones that raised me, so it makes sense that the connection I felt to them was strong. My mother worked in the city and my dad was often out of the country for work, so my early years were heavily shaped by them. They recounted tales of the Baba Yaga who would snatch up children in the forest, and of the Dullahan who would claim souls that were close to crossing over. Instead of scaring me, I became entranced, fixated on the mysteries and origins of these stories. My parents even made comments on how they would tell me too many stories and fill my head with nonsense, that I would turn out to be weird and unusual. They weren't far from the truth. But my grandparents didn't like hearing that, as they too were shaped in the same way that I was, and had an affinity for the strange and mysterious. Well, the years passed and my passion for all things spooky continued to grow. I remember in high school, I would spend the night at my grandparents' place every Friday and we would fire up the VCR, watching scary movies and eating pizza. They would often pause the movie to comment on the script or story, and explain the origin of where it came from. Words were not enough to explain the interest I had. They kept me hanging on their every word. One year for my birthday, they gave me a book on myths and legends, stories from around the world, cautionary tales of things and places to avoid. I would stay up late at night with a flashlight under the blanket, reading them until I inevitably fell asleep. These memories are burned into my mind. They are so vivid that they feel as it were yesterday. In my last year of high school, things changed considerably. One Friday, I came home to drop off my things from school, ready to head over to my grandparents' house, when I found my parents standing in the doorway. I can still see their faces, frowns drawn out, a somber air around them. I knew without them having to tell me that something had happened. It turned out to be a car accident. Some drunk driver had plowed into them and the coward fled the scene. They never caught the guy. In one moment, they were both gone. My world came crashing down. I remember walking through the doorway of their house, expecting the familiar scent of baked cookies and sound of their laughter to fill the air. But instead, it was cold and hollow. It wasn't the home I remember. Just an empty house. Empty of the life they filled it with. So cold. We were the first ones to arrive at the funeral. It was my first taste of death. A strange feeling. Being that I had been so fascinated by it my entire life, it was surreal to be there in the presence of it. The small room had both of their caskets side by side with the lids open. My parents had said that I didn't need to go in, or even look at them. But I wanted to. Needed to. I had to pay my respects after all, and look at them one last time. I had envisioned a horrible sight, something reminiscent of the horror movies we loved so much. But instead, they looked peaceful, as if they were sleeping. At rest. I cried as I placed my hand on theirs and noticed how cold they were. Like stone. Out of nowhere I was startled when a hand gripped my shoulder and gave a reassuring squeeze. I whipped around to find a man in a dark suit standing there. He was tall, lanky, and oddly pale. "Don't cry," he said softly. It was Mr. Allen, the funeral director. I looked up at him with tears in my eyes, and he gave a soft smile, lines etched deeply into his face. Our loved ones are always with us. They're never far away when we need them. Those words stay with me to this day. I turned back at my grandparents. They looked alive, as if they were just resting. I wanted so badly to shake them, to scream and yell until they woke up. But I knew it wouldn't do any good. I touched my grandfather's hand, trails of makeup coming off on my fingers. They had truly worked some sort of magic to make them look alive. "Did you do this?" I asked in between sobs. The man closed his eyes and gave a smile as he nodded. "Yes, Ethan, I did. It's my job. I am tasked with making them look as they did in life." I looked over at the doorway where my mother and father were in tears while holding each other, my father occasionally looking up at me to offer a strained smile. Mr. Allen continued, "It's an honorable thing, you know, to ensure the deceased are properly taken care of in this time. We help navigate the difficult journey they have ahead of them, and their families as well." I thought on those words. The fact that he provided the dead with peace and tranquility, to give them and their families closure. I guess that's why it led me down this path. After completing high school, I pursued a degree in mortuary science. I can't say that my parents were thrilled about it, but after that ordeal, I was driven by an insatiable thirst for knowledge about death rituals, grief support, and the compassionate handling of the deceased. I wanted to bring peace to the departed, as well as the living. So I immersed myself in funeral customs, embalming techniques, and the practical aspects of the funeral industry over the next few years. It certainly wasn't easy, and at times it was troubling, especially in my first year dealing with the bodies. Sometimes I half expected them to open their eyes. But thankfully, I got over it and managed to complete my studies with no issues. Upon graduation, I sought employment in the funeral industry, initially working as an assistant. I was meticulous, doing everything by the book, going above and beyond to ensure the outcome was perfect, oftentimes staying late. My commitment, compassion, and attention to detail quickly became apparent, drawing the attention of the owner, Mr. Allen. We became very close, and he would tell me stories of how he started and also his time as a funeral director. The good and the bad. But with everything that happened, he showed me that he was a person of empathy, just as I was. I felt like I had found a good fit there. During my time as an assistant, I can't say that I ever experienced anything strange. Perhaps the odd time a light flickered here and there, but I can't exactly chalk that up to the paranormal. Even though my love for the macabre seeped into my many interests like movies, art, and music, at that point, I had never encountered a spooky event, or so much as a cold draft while working in the basement of the funeral home. But one day, that all changed. It was a fall evening as the sun had begun sinking back into the horizon, and I had just entered the mortuary to find Mr. Allen greeting me. "Ethan, I'm glad you're here," he said, somewhat flustered. "A unique opportunity has presented itself and I'm in a bit of a bind. Would you care to take over as the hearse driver for the next few weeks? Seems we're in need of one and you are the perfect candidate. I can handle the work here and also your pay won't change, so no need to worry about that." I didn't quite know how to feel about it, but it wasn't a bad thing. It certainly fueled my curiosity. It would give me some time away from the basement at least. "Sure thing, Mr. Allen. I'd be happy to help. It'll be a nice change of pace." "Wonderful, Ethan. I'll make the arrangements. I hope you're okay to start right away," he asked, raising a bushy white eyebrow. "Definitely. Just tell me where to go and what to do when I'm there." I smiled, and I could see this took a considerable amount of stress off his shoulders. "Excellent. Sit tight, I'll be back with everything you need." Mr. Allen briskly walked away into another room of the funeral home. It was strangely quiet, and now it was just me sitting there. Mr. Allen had really done well for himself, and I wondered if perhaps one day I could take over as funeral director at Pine Deep Funeral Home. The place was really starting to grow on me. Moments later, I heard metallic jingling, and in he came with a satchel and a set of keys. He ushered me out the doors leading to the back where the hearse was parked. It was a well-maintained vehicle, pristine and well-kept. I'm not sure who took care of it beforehand or why there was a vacancy, but they sure did a good job. "Here you go, my boy," Mr. Allen said with a smile, holding the keys out and dropping them into my outstretched hand. "Your first delivery will be to the cemetery outside of town. Take your time and please be careful." Sadly, the deceased did not have any loved ones to see him off, so you'll be arriving to drop the casket to the groundskeepers at the cemetery. That didn't sit very well with me. Why would no one want to see this man off in this difficult time? He was truly alone, and it broke my heart. "Sure thing." I smiled and walked around the hearse, inspecting the silver ornamental design along its sides, until I caught a glimpse of the casket that lay in the back. "Do call if there are any issues. And Ethan, thank you for doing this. You're really saving my skin." He smiled widely as I got into the vehicle and closed the door. I sat there for several minutes, taking everything in. It was quite an adjustment. I know what you're thinking. You handle bodies, this is nothing. But truth be told, I had not dealt with the end process before. I prepared the bodies, sure, but I never saw them off. This time, I'd be the last one to be with them, save for the grave diggers. But there was almost an appreciation for it. Someone to accompany them in their last farewell. Well, let me tell you, as I left the funeral home, the skies darkened up and rain started pouring. It was so perfectly timed that it felt eerie, as if gone to plan. I turned up the radio to ease my nerves, but there was only static. Clicking off the radio, I continued down the quiet back roads, seeing no one else in sight. This was the first night I felt something different. During that drive, I began to hear whispers, as if carried by the wind, seeming to come from the back of the hearse. The rain was falling hard on the roof and was becoming quite loud, but I was certain that beneath the deafening roar of the rain, I could hear a voice calling out. My imagination was running wild in the face of the storm. I nervously shifted in my seat, adjusting the rear-view mirror to make sure no one was back there. And of course there wasn't. It was just me and the dead. The hair on my neck stood up the entire drive to the cemetery. The gates were still open when I pulled up, and I quickly found 4 men standing beside an open grave. I hopped out in the rain and confirmed this was the correct location and opened up the hatch to allow them to remove the casket. A chill ran through me as it slid out and was put in its place. I wanted to leave, but something told me to stay. So there I stood alongside the coffin as it was slowly lowered and covered with dirt. I'm not religious or anything, but I said a prayer all the same. Not really for me, but for the man laying in the ground. The least I could have done was be there in his last moment before the earth swallowed him up and the ferryman collected the traveler. I thought about that night for a while, wondering if what I heard was real. I wanted to mention it to someone, but I was sure that I was just imagining things. I continued on as a driver, happy to help Mr. Allen. I knew he appreciated it after all. A few weeks later, there would be another incident that would leave me questioning things a bit more profoundly. I had gone out of town for a funeral and assisted with carrying the casket to the plot. There were only a handful of people there, so I decided to stay alongside them and pay my respects. I found that was something I always did. Just felt right. Anyway, by the time I gave my condolences and said my goodbyes, it was already dark and I had a fair bit of driving to do. I was in no rush and really enjoyed taking the back roads, so I decided that was exactly what I would do. For the majority of the ride, it was uneventful. The radio was playing some of my favorite songs and the moon was bright and full. It was very calming. Then suddenly, that static started. Must be the reception out here, I said aloud, reassuring myself. I fiddled around with the knobs, changing the station, when I decided to switch it off. It was rather quiet and eerie. And then the tapping came. The strangest feeling came over me. There was an inexplicable heaviness in the air. The light tapping grew into a series of hurried knocks. And then suddenly I felt like I was being watched. It's a very odd feeling and hard to describe, but it's like another form of energy is in proximity. Well, I looked up at the rear view, and in the back window of the hearse, there was a woman with a blank expression, staring at me. I screamed and instinctively turned the wheel and slammed on the brakes, coming to a screeching halt. My hand found the handle and the door flew open. There I was, standing in the middle of the road. The car was still running, headlights beaming out into the darkness. The gnarled tree limbs overhead seemed to reach down and the hooting owls pierced the silence. Shivers rippled over my skin. I was hesitant to look in the back, afraid of what I'd find. Afraid that someone had jumped in and hitched a ride. It must have been a while before I moved, but eventually I found myself walking over to the rear of the hearse, cupping my hands against the glass and pressing my face close. Then the sound of pounding fists against the glass erupted. I even felt the vibrations from the unseen force hitting the glass. My heart was in my throat. Without thinking, I threw open the door, ready to find the culprit responsible for the prank. But there was no one there. Words cannot describe my state of mind. I was sure I saw a woman looking at me, but maybe it was the trick of the light or something. But I know I heard and felt those knocks. I must have stood outside on that empty stretch of road for 20 minutes before I found the courage to go back in. Thankfully, there were no other events for the rest of the drive back, although I was constantly looking over my shoulder. I had half a mind to ask Mr. Allen when I got back who I had brought to the cemetery, but I never did. I guess I didn't want to find out. But as I spent more time on the road and in the cemeteries alone at night, I started experiencing things that I couldn't quite explain. Sometimes while approaching the vehicle, I would catch the interior lights flickering, as if someone was switching the light on and off. The mechanic couldn't explain it and said there was nothing wrong with the wiring or battery. Then, I started getting these bouts of random chills that would run through me, like the temperature suddenly dropped 20 degrees. I could only attribute it to a draft, but still, in the back of my mind, I wondered if it was something more. It was late one night in October when I had to pick up a body from the hospital morgue. Things had been fairly calm as of late, and I was hoping the streak would continue. I showed up at the gates and the security guard eyed me down. Maybe the sight of a young guy working as a hearse driver was not something he saw often. "Nice night, isn't it?" I said instinctively. I'm not very good at small talk and can get nervous, so I tend to just blurt out whatever comes to mind. He didn't say anything and just stared at me with a disinterested look. My hands fumbled around the darkness for my identification, raising it up to the light once I found it. He hopped on the radio and called in with my information, quickly confirming that they were indeed expecting me. A moment later he buzzed me in without saying another word, and the old iron gates opened up to allow me through. "Excuse me," I said meekly. "Could you point me in the direction to the morgue? It's my first time here." I gave a sheepish smile before he appeared to sigh and point to the right side of the compound. Not wanting to bother him any further, I gave him a quick nod before coasting in, and he turned back toward a small black and white monitor with a live feed of the hospital. As the gates closed behind me, I realized how dark and lonely that part of the hospital really was. The building was quite old, constructed in the late 1800s from what I remember. A very industrial look about it that possessed an eerie quality. I wasn't familiar with that part of the hospital as I've only ever gone into the emergency room, and that was just one time. Not that it matters, but I broke my ankle once skating and had my grandfather drive me over. Feels like a lifetime ago. Anyway, I must have been driving around for 5 minutes before I finally found a set of double doors, illuminated by a flickering light above. There were no signs and nothing else in proximity, so I decided to give it a try. With the car backed up, I quickly hopped out, pulling my jacket tightly over my neck. The night air was crisp and the frost was biting at my skin. The fallen autumn leaves crunched under my feet as I approached the door and tried the handle. It was locked, so I proceeded to knock 3 times. About a minute later, I became unsure if I was in the right place. I was about to knock again when suddenly I heard something stirring from the other side, and the door swung open quickly, missing me by inches. A rough voice spoke from behind the dim light. "Who are you?" they asked in a soft tone of voice. "I'm from Pine Deep Funeral Home, sir." I'm here to pick up the body." I gave a forced smile, unsure what to do with myself. "Ah, yes. Come in, come in. Please, watch your step. It's a bit of a madhouse in here." He wasn't kidding. There were crates stacked everywhere, hallways filled with machinery and gleaming metal tables with long white sheets cascading off the bodies that occupied them. The place was absolutely freezing. The red tile floor felt sticky under my feet as I marched along, and the dim lighting did nothing to better the atmosphere. "I didn't catch your name," the man said suddenly as he stopped in his tracks to turn and face me. His small stature was a bit unusual, but it was his bright blue eyes that cut through me like a knife. "Ethan, sir." "It's Ethan." My anxiety had spiked for some reason. I couldn't help but look away, my stare finding its way to the badge pinned to his lapel pocket. In bold letters, it spelled Dr. Romero. "Well, Ethan, don't be startled by the state of this place. We've been a bit busy to say the least. Death waits for no one." He grinned from ear to ear as he continued along and ushered me toward the room at the end of the hall. "Come, it's right this way," he said as he pointed to a set of green double doors, faded from time. I wondered how many bodies this place had seen, and how long Dr. Romero had been here to see them off. The doors swung open to reveal a large room, white grimy tiles lining the walls. The white fluorescent lights buzzed as we passed underneath them, and the autopsy table lay empty at the center. The doctor reached the long wall of drawers and gripped the handle of one, then stopped before turning back to me. "Now, I'd like you to relay a message to Mr. Allen, if you'd be so kind." I stared at him intently, his bushy white eyebrows reaching up from behind his round gold-rimmed glasses. "Of course," I replied, wondering what he had to say that was so important, the man's face growing serious. "Please tell him that next time." He paused for a moment, leaning closer before continuing. "Don't bring that cheap swill to our poker night. I'm a man of refined taste after all." He let out a hoarse dry laugh before slapping me on the back, chuckling to himself as he spun back around and opened a drawer. "Ah yes, sure thing," I said, laughing nervously, unaware that they were more than just business associates. I helped the doctor pull the drawer out to reveal a sealed body in a black body bag. "Kindly bring that gurney over here and I'll help you load it up." I did as he asked and brought it beside the corpse, and within a few seconds we had transferred it over. I stared at the bag containing a once living person, thinking of who they were and what they did while they were alive. I often did that, daydreaming of what their lives consisted of. The type of people they were. Their profession. It was just something I had always done and thought nothing of it. "Now, here is the paperwork. I just need you to sign and initial right here and here, then you're good to go." I promptly nodded and proceeded to fill in the collections page before handing it back. "Excellent. Well, Ethan, I appreciate you coming on such short notice. I'm sure I'll be seeing you again." The old man smiled, holding out his hand, which I promptly took into mine and gave a hearty shake. He was a bit eccentric, but seemed kind enough. I thanked the doctor before wheeling the body out and back down toward the exit. The corridor seemed longer than before, and I was afraid I had lost my way, but soon my anxiety subsided once I found the double doors and left the building altogether. The cold air greeted me once again and I breathed a sigh of relief, quickly opening up the hatch, then sliding the gurney into place and strapping everything down. It seemed I was right on schedule, and I took a moment to just decompress. There I was, sitting in the driver's seat for a few minutes before I decided to do anything. The timing was perfect, because it started to rain. I could hear the low rumbling of thunder overhead. My hand eventually found its way to the key in the ignition, and once the motor roared to life, I flipped through the radio station until I found something tasteful to distract me. 80s rock seemed to do it. Now, as usual, I had a habit of taking the back roads back to the funeral home. Mr. Allen never told me to do otherwise, but I also found it relaxing, despite the circumstances of having a lifeless passenger. The wipers were on full blast as the rain fell heavily, and I cranked the high beams to get a better view. Well, that was when I ran into a man walking in the middle of the road. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I continued forward, I realized that was not the case. Mind you, the road I was on was seldom used, aside from farmers during the day. At night, seeing people was not common in the slightest. The man was wearing a dark suit and looked unfazed by my presence or the rain. It wasn't until I gave a short honk of the horn that he turned around. A middle-aged man stood before me, a distant look painted on his face, dripping with water. His eyes locked with mine, and slowly he moved to the shoulder of the road, waiting for me to pass. But I didn't. Something in me said to keep going, to avoid stopping, but something else in me screamed for me to help. Reluctantly, I rolled down the window, licking my dry lips before I began yelling over the deafening downpour. "Hey, are you okay?" I shouted. "Do you need a ride?" He kept walking forward and did not even acknowledge my presence. "Are you lost?" I continued, in fear that perhaps he had dementia or something of the sort. The man stopped suddenly, looking forward for a few seconds before turning to me. He nodded, bringing his face close to mine. Shivers rippled across my skin, then he spoke. "I seem to have lost my way." He looked confused and I wondered if perhaps someone was looking for him. I checked my phone, but there was no reception. Just perfect. "Of course. I'm going into town. We can use the phone there if you'd like. How does that sound?" He seemed to smile faintly under the sullen expression before replying. "Yes, that would be nice. Thank you." A chill ran through me as I opened up the door and watched him slowly walk around to the passenger's side, quietly climbing in and sitting with his hands on his knees, always focused forward. The rainwater steadily dripped off his soaked frame as he sat motionless. I turned the radio dial to find something more relaxing, but every channel was filled with static. "My name's Ethan," I stammered, holding out my hand, waiting for his. He genuinely looked confused as he looked at me, then slowly he reached out. His hand was freezing, and he held on for a long time before I pulled away. "I'm heading over to the Pine Deep Funeral Home. It's not far off. You're welcome to call someone to come pick you up. Do you have someone you can call?" He didn't respond and again gave a faint smile and slight nod of his head. It was a strange situation and I really didn't know what to do. In hindsight, I could have gone to the police station directly, but it was pretty late and I had another passenger waiting to be dropped off. The ride back was quiet. He didn't say much, even though I tried to make small talk. I didn't know if that was for his benefit or mine. "So, what's your name?" I asked. But he didn't reply. I caught him several times tracing shapes into the fogged glass as if to distract himself. So after that, I just kept quiet and carefully drove through the storm. A while later, we arrived at the funeral home. It was a little later than I had hoped, but I could see from the light in the back that Mr. Allen was still there. I backed up the hearse under the overhang, right up against the garage door before I started gathering my things from the car. "Now, I just need to run inside and let the owner know what's going on, then we can." My words trailed off as I looked up to find the passenger side door open, the sound of falling rain filling the interior of the hearse. I didn't even see him get up or hear him say anything. The traced shapes on the window were still there, along with a handprint. Quickly jumping out of the car, I looked around for any sign of where he could have gone, but the streets were empty in every direction. That whole night had been very strange, and I didn't think things could get any worse. Suddenly I heard a voice rise up from behind me. "Ah, there you are." I had been wondering if everything was okay. Mr. Allen looked at me from the open doorway, a gentle smile on his face. "Dr. Romero called to let me know you had picked up Mr. Eldridge. Is everything okay?" He looked at me inquisitively. I must have had a strange look about me. I nodded. "Yeah, it's just. I gave a ride to a man caught in the rain, but he got out when we arrived, and now he's gone. It was the strangest thing." Mr. Allen smiled as he wrapped an arm around my shoulders and led me to the back of the hearse. "It's okay, Ethan. You're here now. Help me get our friend into the basement and we can call the police to let them know what happened." I nodded, thinking the entire time about the man in the suit and where he had gone off to. Mr. Allen and I brought the body through several winding hallways and down the ramp leading into the embalming room. It had apparently been a busy night, but this was the last task for the day. Once the gurney was wheeled into the room, we transferred the body bag onto the table and I quickly left Mr. Allen to prepare the individual. On the table across for him was a black rotary phone. I can't believe these still existed. I dialed 911, the whirring of the mechanism clicking with each rotation, until it started ringing. Someone eventually picked up. "Pine Deep Police Department, what is your emergency?" I cleared my throat, unsure of what to say. "Hi, I found a man on the road outside of town. He seemed to be suffering from dementia or something. He was lost. I gave him a ride, but he jumped out of the car and I don't know where he went off to. Maybe you could." As I turned around, my voice trailed off. There on the table, with the bag now unzipped and the deceased's face glowing pale under the light, was the man I had picked up on the road. The soft smile still faintly chiseled into his face. I dropped the phone suddenly from my hand and it fell violently to the floor, bouncing off the hard tile. Mr. Allen looked at me inquisitively, but also with a strange smirk, as if he already knew what I had seen. "What's wrong? Looks like you've seen a ghost."